you for your testimony, and thank you for your willingness to serve. It is a difficult thing to put your family through and everything else, and so I want you to know how much we appreciate that. In your opening testimony, you talked about this war on ISIS, that it will take a while. That's the implication I get from what you wrote, and I think that's certainly true. In Congress here, we rarely declare war these days, but we do authorize the use of military force or pass a so-called AUMF. We've not passed one yet with regard to ISIS. We're still working under an ill-fitting 2001 AUMF with regard to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Senator Kaine and I have offered a bipartisan AUMF to deal with al-Qaeda, or I'm sorry, with ISIS. And we think that it certainly helps to have congressional buy-in, that our allies certainly deserve to know where we are, and our adversaries need to know. What are your thoughts with regard to an AUMF, specifically regarding ISIS?
Well, I think the President-elect, in broad terms, indicated during his campaign and in comments made in other instances that he believes it is important that we not just lightly go into these conflicts, that he would seek the engagement of Congress and the support of Congress in some means, whether it's through a sense of the Congress or specific legislation. I would not disagree with your characterization that it is much more powerful when the U.S. shows up with everyone aligned. And I think having the support of the Congress standing behind those decisions to commit U.S. men and women, U.S. military resources, does give us a much stronger position than to engage with allies in building those alliances that are important. And in the case of defeating ISIS, that is one of the first actions that is going to be necessary, is to re-engage with our allies in the area and ensure that we know what they are willing to commit as well. So yes, I would strongly support engaging, certainly at the minimum, with this committee, and ultimately, if legislative action would support our efforts to defeat ISIS, I would be certainly talking to the President about that.
Well, that would certainly be welcomed here. What we don't want to see, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, certainly, but what I would not like to see is what we saw after the promise and the drawing of the red line, which you mentioned in your testimony. When you draw a red line, you said we sent weak or mixed signals with red lines that turned into green lights. I think that's certainly the case, but what happened with the last administration is that red line was drawn, but rather than enforce that red line when it was crossed, the administration came to Congress to ask permission. And we always enjoy the administration coming to us, but when you draw a red line, enforce it. The War Powers Act allows 60 days. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think that kind of collaboration with Congress is using us as a crutch rather than an ally in this battle.
No, I take the point.
With regard to Cuba, you mentioned that their leaders, under the new arrangement we have with diplomatic relations and loosened travel restrictions, I believe you're referring to, their leaders receive much while their people have received little. This serves neither the interest of Cubans or Americans. I would encourage you in the coming weeks and months to look at what has happened in Cuba. Certainly, I think the government is no less repressive with regard to dissidents. That is still going on. But when President Obama allowed Cuban Americans in particular to travel unfettered to Cuba and lifted caps on remittances, it allowed Cubans who had previously worked for the government in Cuba to engage in private sector activity. And from virtually no private sector employment in Cuba, we've gone to about 25% of the Cuban workforce in the private sector. And I would submit that they enjoy now a measure of economic freedom and political freedom that they didn't before. So I think that has benefited the Cuban people and will continue to if we continue the approach that we've now taken. And so I do share your aversion to sanctions, particularly those that are not multilateral. And I think we've seen that in spades in Cuba over the years, where it was only the U.S. who employed sanctions, and then sanctions that weren't comprehensive and didn't mean that much, other than giving the regime there a convenient excuse for the failure of socialism. So I would encourage in the next couple of weeks to look at what's happened in Cuba with regard to our new policy. With regard to Africa, we had a good discussion in my office. You at ExxonMobil have dealt with Africa a lot. Let's talk about soft diplomacy for a while. We have a lot of programs through USAID all over the continent. As you've viewed those programs, in addition to what ExxonMobil has done in the corporate governance area, what works and what doesn't? How can we refashion some of our policies to nudge countries toward democracy that need nudging, or that punish countries where it deems fit, or encourage cooperation with us on security measures or humanitarian measures?
Well, certainly the use of important USAID assistance, it really falls in kind of two broad areas: disaster relief, addressing imminent situations on the ground, whether it's starvation or the result of storms or as a result of conflict, providing assistance to relieve the immediate suffering. That is an important part of USAID. Over the past few years, in looking at the balance of that against what I would call development assistance, which is designed to create change, which hopefully becomes a sustainable change, that regrettably, the disaster assistance part of that budget has grown, and that means there's less available for development. Other important ways in which we can provide assistance, though, are through other mechanisms, such as the Millennial Challenge Corporation. For those countries that qualify, that's a different model. And so I think in terms of what is the issue we're trying to address, that then conditions how do we put obligations on the country then to modify behaviors, whether it's take steps to reduce corruption, improve the strength of governments and their own institutional capacity to manage their affairs. Where I have seen good progress is when assistance was put into the country with some requirement that, for instance, they modify or streamline their permitting process. One of the ways to begin to reduce corruption is to remove the complexities of how people are able to carry out their activities. The more steps you have in the process, the more opportunities there are for people to be taking something out of it or adding a cost to it. So I know there are examples where governments have been required to simplify the simple thing of a citizen going down and getting a driver's license, or the citizen getting a permit to buy an automobile or a piece of equipment. It only goes to one place. You can shine a bright light on that, and it's easy to follow the money, as they say. And that in and of itself can be very effective in beginning to change the behaviors within some of these developing countries. So I think where we can tie our assistance to obligations, it's important that we do so and then able to follow up. And again, we have, I think it's every country's issues need to be examined on a case-by-case basis, and then try to target and design assistance to advance America's values and help that country continue its journey along better governance. But in some cases, if it's disaster relief, that's hard to do, because it's hard to start feeding starving people, and then when the host government's not meeting its obligations, we're suddenly going to stop feeding starving people. Those are very difficult choices to make, and I understand and appreciate that.
We had talked in our office about some of the programs like PEPFAR. Can you talk about how that has helped our situation and what you've observed in Africa in terms of goodwill?
Well, PEPFAR, I think, clearly has been one of the most extraordinarily successful programs in Africa. I saw it up close and personal because of ExxonMobil had taken on the challenge of eradicating malaria because of business activities in Central Africa, where malaria is quite prevalent, and worked with competent NGOs, some of which were receiving funding through PEPFAR, some through other agencies, along with other public-private partnerships. So eradicating malaria, there's been a great deal of progress made. That's where I saw it up close and personal. But I know that PEPFAR broadly has brought so much goodwill from Africa, recognition of the goodwill and the compassionate nature of the American people. It's probably one of the best projections of the American goodwill and compassion into the continent that I think you'll find anywhere. Broadly recognized by leaders, but more importantly, it's broadly recognized by those it touches.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator.